Welcome, everyone. We're going to let folks get in the meeting and then we'll get started. And welcome, everyone. We're just going to give another minute to let folks enter the meeting. Okay, we'll get started. Welcome, everyone. I am Joy O'Nash with ERG, a contractor supporting the work of the West Coast Climate Materials Management Forum, and I will be moderating today's webinar titled Materials Management Emissions Reduction Strategies and Climate Action Plans. Before we begin today's webinar and introduce our speakers, I'd like to briefly go over some housekeeping details. For closed captioning of today's discussion, please select the closed captioning icon at the bottom of your screen. All participants are in listen-only mode now. Please email Jenna Feinauer at erg.com if you experience any technical difficulties with Zoom. Please submit questions for discussion into the Q&A feature. And today's session will be recorded and shared at a later date through the forum website. And before we get started, I'm going to give a short disclaimer here about on behalf of the forum. Today's webinar is designed to share information about climate action plans and other examples and information. We've invited speakers to share their views on topics that connect climate to materials to get participants thinking and talking about new strategies for achieving our environmental goals. Mention of trade names or commercial products does not constitute endorsement or recommendation for use. Please note that the opinions, ideas, or data presented by speakers do not represent forum members' policy or constitute endorsement by the forum. I'm going to give you a quick overview about the forum if you're new to us. The West Coast Climate Materials Management Forum, or Forum for short, started in 2008. The forum is a collaboration of state, local, and tribal governments working to establish sustainable materials management practices. More than 40% of U.S. greenhouse gas emissions result from production, transportation, use, and disposal of material goods. Materials management is an approach to using and reusing resources most efficiently and sustainably throughout their life cycle, which you see illustrated here. It seeks to minimize materials used and all associated environmental impacts, especially climate impacts. The forum's mission is to inspire, inform, and illustrate how communities can significantly reduce greenhouse gas emissions by improving the way they source, use, and recover materials. Okay, so let's get started. This is our agenda for today. We're going to begin with an overview on comprehensive climate action plans, lead into consumption-based accounting with an example from Oregon, hear about local government examples, as well as examples of emissions reduction calculations. Again, we will have time for Q&A at the end of our session. Please go ahead and put your questions into the Q&A feature along the way. We may interrupt if it makes sense to do that along the way after the different speakers. Otherwise, we will have time reserved at the end. So with that, I am going to turn the program over to Jenny Stevenson with EPA.
Hi, thanks. Well, welcome everyone. So glad you're here. As Joy mentioned, my name is Jenny Stevenson. I'm with EPA's Region 9 Zero Waste Program. And for the last year, I've served as co-lead for the CPRG, the Climate Pollution Reduction Grant Program, their technical assistance forum focused on waste and materials management. So I'm going to kick off our session now with just a 5-minute overview of the climate pollution reduction grants, which are funding grantees across the country to develop comprehensive climate action plans. And this all is, the whole program is thanks to the Inflation Reduction Act, which represents the largest climate investment in our history, with programs including $5 billion for the Climate Pollution Reduction Grants Program. And there's really two parts to this program. through the climate pollution reduction grants. And I'm just going to start saying CPRG. Sorry to live in acronyms, but that's a mouthful. So EPA's CPRG program provides grants to state, local governments, tribes, and territories to develop and implement ambitious plans to reduce greenhouse gas emissions and other harmful air pollutants. So through this two-phase program, which was authorized under the Inflation Reduction Act, the program provides $250 million for non-competitive planning grants, and that's really our focus for today. And then additionally, there was 4.6 billion of competitive implementation grants, which have been awarded. So with these planning grants, it is like one of the first time in history, like a lot of governments had started developing their own climate action plans, but this funding and the support associated with CPRG really represents like a whole like nationwide effort to think about how our actions influence our climate emissions, and then identifying tangible measures that are quantifiable and meaningful that will address and reduce greenhouse gas emissions. So a little bit of a picture of the CPRG planning grant recipients. It includes 45 states, the District of Columbia, Puerto Rico, 82 metropolitan statistic areas. These are kind of cities, and a lot of these larger metro areas are kind of coordinated climate action plans with a regional approach to climate action planning that allow for more efficient and transformative action. So they're kind of broader than just a single city. And what you can see here is the distribution of the states and metropolitan areas, MSAs, another acronym. And then here are the tribes. We have more than 90 tribes and tribal consortia that receive planning grants, along with 4 territories. So all across the board, folks are working to develop climate action plans. And the first step of this was developing priority climate action plans. So all the planning, and this has happened pretty quickly. So all the planning grantees received their grant awards last fall, in fall 2023. So, and they've already submitted priority climate action plans. And what these priority climate action plans included are the lighter blue hexagon. So they had GHG inventory information, identified some quantified GHG measures in priority sectors and priority areas, included an analysis of the benefits to low-income and disadvantaged communities, another acronym, LIDAC, and then a discussion of the authority to implement the measures and the activities that they had identified in those priority sectors. So those are all completed, the priority climate action plans, and those are posted on EPA's website. So you can see what folks or the planning grantees have included there. And now we're at the phase of developing comprehensive climate action plans. And those are due in about a year from now, December of 2025, for states and the MSAs, the metropolitan statistical areas. So now the planning grantees are really working on these comprehensive climate action plans, referred to in shorthand as CCAPs, which refine and expand upon their initial plans. So even if the PCAP didn't include measures on waste or materials management, it can be included in the CCAP. It can be expanded, and we really are looking for all the significant sectors and sources, sinks, sources and sectors of greenhouse gas emissions within a jurisdiction should be addressed within the comprehensive climate action plan. And so These comprehensive climate action plans integrate both long-term strategies with priority measures, identify solutions to the implementation challenges, and continue robust and meaningful public engagement. So if you haven't yet been involved and you are looking to be involved, there's still an opportunity. I think I missed calling out on the previous slide. We do have, and I'll add the links in the chat, but we do have links to all the full listing of all the CPRG planning grantees along with the available contact information. And many of the planning grantees have their own websites and contact information available there. So if you want to get involved, that's a way to get connected. And so we're in the CCAP development phase. And so all the CCAPs include greenhouse gas reduction measures on all the sectors, including waste and materials management, which is our focus. So waste and materials management, typically from a kind of sector-based inventory, and we'll get into the weeds of this with our next speakers, we'll really go more into it. The waste management sector, primarily landfills and wastewater treatment facilities, account for about 3 to 5% of the greenhouse gas emissions. Though if you consider the upstream emissions from the production, the transportation, the consumption, the use of consumer products and the materials upstream, it has a much broader opportunity to really intervene to significantly reduce greenhouse gas emissions than if we were to just look at the end of life management. And it's really exciting to kind of have this different perspective of where you can have a broader influence to this global problem of climate change. And we've already seen even before the climate, even before CPRG, we have examples of governments within their climate action plans, including materials management and waste measures. And these are some really helpful examples also on EPA's website of looking for ways that other governments have included waste and materials management in their climate plans that can be helpful as planning grantees and other organizations that are involved with the CCAP development can consider to see like approaches and quantification approaches that others have taken. So now I'll turn it over to Jenna with Oregon Department of Environmental Quality to show us an example of what Oregon has done.
Absolutely. Thanks so much, Jenny. My name is Jenna Throckmorton. I'm here from Oregon Department of Environmental Quality with my colleague Martin Brown. I believe we have David Alloway as well. First, I'm going to start us by just kind of walking through an example of what consumption-based emissions accounting looks like. As Jenny mentioned, it's a very ripe area full of opportunity for us to reduce possible greenhouse gas emissions. Oregon recently updated their consumption-based emissions inventory and in collaboration with our contractor, Stockholm Environment Institute, uncovered a wealth of exciting opportunities that explore that intersection of material consumption and greenhouse gas reduction. So before we dive too deep into that, I wanted to get us warmed up with a quick example of consumption-based accounting. And today we're going to start with one little piece of economic demand. It's going to be the cup of coffee that I'm drinking this morning. So I was the source of the demand. I bought the beans, I made them into the drink, and now as a conscientious person, I'm curious about all the greenhouse gas emissions associated with this. So to make the coffee, I had to boil the water. So you'll see a little gas burner here. And those emissions definitely happened within the borders of Oregon. So that's why Oregon is highlighted here green on the map. The beans that I used today were roasted in New Jersey. So there were some emissions from the combustion used and the freight taken to bring the coffee to me. But you'll see New Jersey is highlighted here now. The beans I was using were monsoon Malabar beans, which come from India, and I've highlighted that here on the map in purple. So we know agricultural producers require trucks, automotives to complete their operations, but before the truck could be driven, it had to be made in a factory. Those factories use large amounts of energy and therefore represent large sources of emissions. It's hard to know exactly where the truck in this image was made, but the biggest car part suppliers in the world are China, Spain, Ireland, Canada, Mexico, and the Midwest of the United States. So emissions for the truck could have originated all over. And I will stop here because it's possible to go on forever. And we didn't even get into international shipping or the emissions linked to making the coffee cup itself. But this example is enough to show that in the simplest moments in life, we all depend on this economic web that stretches far beyond our state borders, and we influence emissions in all of those places. However, in Oregon, our standard is the sector-based accounting method, which is also known as territorial emissions accounting, and it only includes emissions that occur within our state's borders. But when we look at this map, it's clear that such a limited view leaves a significant portion of emissions unaccounted for. So consumption-based emissions actually allow us to see beyond borders in two ways. First, it makes us aware that technically our picture is incomplete. There are emissions that we're omitting. But secondly, it serves as a constant reminder that what we do here at home influences the lives of others far away. And this relationship is true in the inverse. Others far away have the ability to influence our lives here because emissions don't recognize borders. And it's not just an economic web, it's a web of people and experiences, and it's something by which we're all linked in impact. So this relationship can be seen here from our recent analysis that we performed here in Oregon while updating our consumption-based emissions inventory, which I'm going to cover a little bit more in depth soon, but you'll notice on this graph that our sector-based emissions, which is the line of green triangles on the bottom, has decreased and steadily begun to plateau in recent years, whereas our consumption-based emissions, the blue line above, have continued to steeply increase. So what does that mean? Well, that relationship can be further illustrated in this Venn diagram here, where we see that consumption-based emissions, the blue circle on the right, are, and this is specifically for Oregon, are greater than the size of our sector-based emissions. And in fact, over half of those sector-based emissions actually overlap with the scope of consumption-based emissions. So one way we can understand what this actually means in our real world and our applications is that sector-based emissions kind of represent our exports, the things that we produce here within the state, but can be exported out. They can be grass seed for Oregon, microchips, timber. And our consumption-based emissions represent what we have to import from elsewhere to live in Oregon. So in a way, we can kind of visualize it as the cost to live. And so this relationship that we've seen with increase of consumption kind of materializes, no pun intended here, when we see that materials are a driving growth in total emissions. It's something that has steadily increased over time while our efforts on efficiency have helped reduce electricity and fuel use. We understand now that this is part of the picture and there's more that we can do to combat that rise in material consumption emission. So where a lot of this information has come from is DEQ, in collaboration with our contractor Stockholm Institute, updated our consumption-based emissions inventory, and we produced a legislative report that has also updated the amount of emissions, or sorry, we have updated our inventory to reflect 2021 data, and our report includes a wealth of opportunities and identified policies and policy areas that we can dig a little bit deeper into here. We evaluated a number of outcomes such as smart growth, our built environment, our food systems, transportation, and within those categories, we were able to pull out types of policies, and while using our evaluation framework, we're able to just generate an incredible amount of information that is wholly beneficial for, theorizing through incorporating materials into a comprehensive climate action plan. And there's a lot of information that we could continue to cover, but for the sake of time, I want to open the floor up a little bit for questions before we move on to Mia from StopWaste. Yeah, I guess we'll start with some Q&A.
Thank you, Jenna. There's one question in the Q&A right now that's actually for Jenny, from her presentation. It came in then. The question is, are there climate pollution reduction grants for K through 12 school districts to develop climate action plans? And I think maybe she's responded to that person, but maybe you can also answer here, Jenny.
Yeah, I'll type up the answer. School districts weren't directly called out or funded, but they're included within the geographic boundaries of the state and MSA CCAPs. And what's relevant for everyone, and I'll include the link in the chat, EPA does have a funding page that is being updated regularly of existing federal funding opportunities that align with climate action plans and sectors.
Thank you. And just a reminder to the audience, in this webinar style, please do enter your questions using the Q&A feature at the bottom of your screen. I see that some people are entering them in the chat, so if I can read those, but it would be helpful for us to get them in the Q&A feature. But let's see what's come in here. I'll read out this long one about EPDs. EPDs report emissions A1 through A3 typically, and it's my understanding that the data reported includes emissions outside Oregon territory for concrete EPDs in particular. Do you think EPDs can help drive low carbon material procurement if more were developed for high emitting materials such as asphalt and steel? There are some EPDs published and it's great, but not every municipality has a policy built in to require EPDs for materials.
Absolutely. Loaded question, but great point. Yeah, EPDs are something that we highlight in the report as, an opportunity to better quantify our embodied carbon emissions that are in the built environment. I wish I was looking at the question because it was good. Okay, found it.
In the chat, yeah.
Perfect. So I do think EPDs can absolutely help drive low carbon material. At the very least, it can help generate a market where folks are knowledgeable and able to select better choices for themselves and be a more informed consumer in that way. I think advocating for EPDs from a policy standpoint would be great, would be a great way to start that because we know that it's quite disparate in its consistency, especially in terms of like implementing it at a state level. So, yes, I hope I
Jenna,
answered.
we do have a clarifying question about what is an EPD, if you wouldn't mind.
Yeah, in the world of acronyms, it's an environmental product declaration. So one way we can visualize it is like a nutrition label, but for our material items and their environmental impact.
Thank you. Okay, some other questions have come in. How do you begin the conversation for governments to start looking at consumption-based accounting when it seems much more broad in scope and harder to quantify?
Another great question. For us, it came in the way of a legislative mandate. Our legislature wanted us, well, because we've had our consumption-based emissions inventory since 2005, I believe. So it's been an inventory that has been a part of our work for some time, but hasn't necessarily received a center light. So it's a tough question. Maybe Martin or actually David would be better at answering on how that conversation started, because I came in after that conversation started. But uh, it's definitely a conversation that's good to start. So
Thank you. And we can come back to this at the Q&A at the end when we've heard from the other presentations as well. I'll give another one or two here. Someone asks you to please elaborate on item number 12, lighter weight cars, considering that cars are getting bigger and heavier, such as SUVs and electric vehicles, way more.
yeah. So what that outcome evaluation was, how would making lighter weight cars reduce greenhouse gas emissions? And they reduce them in some of the ways that are obvious: less fuel used because the car has less weight. Also, what our evaluation kind of looked at was like advocating for policy that would possibly put, some kind of producer component on, I guess, regulating the weight of cars. And Martin, maybe you've got more to add to this.
Definitely. I think in terms of all the specific options evaluated on this slide, the great thing is that the reports that we just published, the sort of consumption-based report to the legislature with its appendices, have full technical details about all the assumptions used in these actions, and also, the policy approaches that were considered. So there's an incredible wealth of detail about all these options. And, it's like 400 pages. So it's hard for us to remember all of the details for everyone. But yeah, lighter weight cars is one of the transportation things we quantified.
Thank you,
Thank
Martin.
you.
You're much more concise than I would have been, so thank you.
Let's see, I'll get to this next one here. Do you have quantitative long-term goals for CBEI GHG? Seems like sector-based is easier to show progress, but CBEI is going up. So wondering what is being considered for long-term metrics.
I think David would be the best person to answer that one.
That's what I was gonna say. Yeah. If David's available, or if that's one we can. Oh, I see he's off mute. Perfect. Go, David.
Hello, everyone. Yes. Oh, hold on. I am available. So at present, the state of Oregon does not have statewide goals to reduce consumption-based emissions, but 2 weeks ago, our state's Climate Action Commission voted to formally recommend that our legislature adopt statewide goals to reduce consumption-based emissions, recognizing the importance of these emissions and the value, the importance that goals have signaling intent. And I'll note that the technical report from SEI that Jenna mentioned, chapter 5 of that report has an entire discussion paper devoted just to the topic of consumption-based goals, giving illustrations of different analytical frameworks by which consumption goals could be set, as well as examples of local and national governments that have adopted such goals. Thanks.
Thanks, David. Well, I'll do one more question now, then we'll carry on with the presentations. Again, we can come back to Q&A at the end with what time we have remaining. The next question here, would cap and trade help with consumption-based emissions or only geographically based emissions?
Cap and trade, I imagine, would definitely help with consumption-based emissions because it would have an effect on our consumption behavior. So pretty much anything that impacts how we consume or the options that we have to consume would ultimately impact consumption-based emissions.
All right. Thank you, Jenna and Martin and David. So we will carry on with the next part of the presentations.
Thank you all so much.
Great, so I think I am taking it from here. Excellent. Well, clearly there's a lot to discuss, and there are more questions that we can hopefully get to at the end. It's really exciting that there's so much interest, and the questions are great. We're really digging into the kind of nuts and bolts of it. So I am Mia Kitahara, Program Manager at StopWaste. We're a Joint Powers Authority in Alameda County, California, and we have been following this work for a while now, and we are big fans of the Oregon DEQ study. I highly recommend checking it out. Not only is it a wealth of information and new thinking, it's really a good read. So just to plug that. And I don't believe we put a link to where to find that report. So if somebody could do that while I'm talking, I think that would be really helpful. So today I get to kind of bring this down into the local government level, because there are states doing CCAPs, but there are also MSAs doing CCAPs. There are the metropolitan regions doing CCAPs. And so I think seeing the local opportunities is also great. So I'll start with the Venn diagram that Jenna had also shown. This is also applicable to the smaller regional scale, and it actually may be more pronounced, right? As you start to shrink in the geographic kind of size that you're looking at, more and more of your goods are being imported, and so more and more of your emissions are showing up in the consumption-based and not in the sector-based emissions. So I am going to be sharing a bunch of links. Thank you, Milas, for putting that in there. So this is a link to the C40 report that did CBEIs for all of their members. This was a few years ago, but I think it's a helpful resource, which really showed that, especially at the city level, the amount of discrepancy between the CBEIs and the sector-based emissions is much more pronounced. An example from our area in Alameda County, the city of Albany is a small primarily residential city of 20,000 people, and they found that their CBEI was 6 times as much as their sector-based emissions inventory. So this is really an opportunity for consumption choices in these places to make an impact, a bigger impact than what they could within their boundaries. So I think a quick takeaway might be also that the CBEIs tend to highlight the same things, no matter where you are. If you're kind of in a generally more consumer versus producer region, materials are going to count more, food is going to count, so some of the themes that DEQ found, we've also found independently. And I think a takeaway might be you may not need to do your whole full-blown CBEI in order to start taking action on some of these high impact strategies. So this is just a quick tool that you could access already at coolclimate.org/calculator. It's basically a household footprint. If you put in some information about your region and see what a household is and multiply that out by the number of households, then you generally get a very rough CBI. I wouldn't make policy around it, but it just gives you that initial snapshot and entryway into this work. And I'll also mention that we are working with UC Berkeley to do inventories for all jurisdictions in California. So every city should have a CBI next year in California. So stay tuned for that. So another way to look at all of these emissions we import doesn't require a CBI. Even in the standard sector-based emissions inventory protocol, you have scope 3 emissions. So this is, again, from the same C40 report that shows scope 1 is what's happening within your boundary. Scope 2 is your imported electricity emissions. And then scope 3 is everything else. So you could choose to do a supply chain kind of life cycle emissions bit on any material that is of interest. So you could choose some of the high impact things like food and do kind of a supply chain analysis scope 3 and include it in your inventory. So this is all other indirect emissions. So I tried to do this method for our county, and disclaimers, this is not official at all. And it's cobbling together different data sources, so we can't really make any conclusions from this, but I just wanted to illustrate what it might look like. Right, so to do the scope 3 method. So you have your scope 1, again, transportation and gas within our county. Scope 2 is the electricity we import. And then scope 3 for safe food and goods could be of similar magnitude. right? So scope 3, if this is happening, scope 1, if this is happening within our county, but if we're importing it, we're calling it scope 3. And without seeing this, we really are creating a carbon blind spot of everything that is outside of our view, but that we do have, as Jenna was mentioning, influence over. And I believe I'm going to talk about how these categories specifically have economic and community development opportunities that I think is so core to what the CPRG is also trying to accomplish. So as Jenny was saying at the beginning, the CPRG really has created an unprecedented wave of CCAPs, comprehensive climate action plans, that are going to be happening. And it really will set, I think, the practice going forward in how climate action plans are done, because it's a cohort going through together. So I think we don't want to miss the opportunity to put into common practice all of the materials related reduction strategies that could have a huge impact, and also connect regions together, because the scope 3 from my region is the scope 1 for somebody else's region, right? So how can we collaborate kind of in that trade mode to reduce all of the emissions? So similar to, I think, DEQ's report, some areas kind of come up to the top in terms of opportunities. I'm going to give one example each of a local climate action plan that has highlighted something in each of these opportunity areas. And these opportunity areas are not only GHG reduction opportunities, but again, provide some community health or public benefit and economic opportunities that make climate action so much more impactful in our communities. And so Jenny's slide had the link to the EPA database of all the CAPs that have materials related measures in them, which is a great resource. And I am not going to link each of the examples that I have in here because they're all on there. So I would encourage you all to go check out that EPA resource. So the 3 that I'll highlight are from different parts of our county, and they actually each contain all of them, but I'm going to highlight specific examples, starting with food. Right, so from like just a waste perspective, we are trying to divert organics from landfill, and our state has SB 1383, which is really focused on keeping that out. But there is so much more opportunity to reduce GHGs upstream if we prevent that wasted food in the first place, and even before it has a chance to get to compost. So I looked at 3 different data sources and kind of concluded that all of them say that this is like a 6-fold magnitude opportunity here for prevention. For sake of time, I'm just going to kind of flip through these, but we can come back to them. And if anybody really wants to dig into different food waste prevention strategies, I think we should make space for that. And there are other good networks too that EPA hosts for that too. But essentially, optimizing edible food. So not treating it as food waste, but food has this value, and how can we get it to the most people, feed nutrition to the most people, and help people make most of their food dollars. And of the food that we consume, there are lower carbon food options and higher carbon food options. And that is looking at the whole supply chain and their intervention opportunities from the farms, growing practices and what they're growing, to what retailers and restaurants are sourcing. So creating opportunities for them to market lower carbon food options. And then as government purchasers, the opportunity to specify lower carbon food options as well. And I think thank you for putting all the links in the chat. One is this good food purchasing chat, and then the other one from our forum, thank you, Milas. We just had a couple of webinar series from the forum that highlighted both the government procurement and also kind of economic supply chain opportunities. So check those recordings out. So here's the example from our county. City of Fremont looked at food in their climate action plan as also a resilience strategy, right? And within all of these different resilience actions, there is one around low carbon, encouraging low carbon plant-based diets, which relates directly to the consumption-based emissions. One tool that I'll also mention is the ReFed Insights engine, which has a bunch of different strategy ideas in there, as well as an impact calculator. So that's a really user-friendly tool to check out and just play around with to see what the opportunities might be and just familiarize yourself with them. So now shifting over to the construction side, there is so much C&D waste, right? The EPA estimates that it's more than twice the amount of generated municipal solid waste. But a lot of this is inert materials. They don't kind of decompose in landfill, so it doesn't rise up from a sector-based approach to a high opportunity in the waste sector for GHG reduction. It doesn't really, all those inerts don't create methane in the landfill. But where the opportunity really is with C&D materials, well, construction materials, not demolition materials, is in that stage one, A1 through A1 through 3 that was mentioned in a question earlier, and through all of the environmental impacts that the EPDs, the environmental product declarations, disclose. So Carbon Leadership Forum, who I borrowed this graphic from, is a great resource, and hopefully I'm putting into the chat their policy toolkit, which they just revamped, that you can dig a lot deeper into what the opportunities are for embodied carbon in building materials. So I'll mention what's happening in California, and this I'll talk about EPDs in this slide too, is that starting as of July this year, really large non-residential, 100,000 square foot resident non-res, and then 50,000 square foot schools must comply with one of these options to address embodied carbon. And they are pretty achievable options, but it's the first time that we've put embodied carbon into building code, right? So you can either reuse an existing building substantially or do a whole building life cycle analysis and reduce that 10% from a baseline, or get the EPDs from key high emitting materials and make sure that they're under a certain threshold, which is quite achievable. What an MSA or a local government could do within that context, well, if you're outside of California, you could study the CalGreen and see if you want to copy parts of it. And within California, you can easily just adopt, well, not politically easily, but you could technically easily adopt one of the tiers, which has more rigorous thresholds, and so would result in lower and higher reductions. Or you could lower the square footage threshold for the buildings that it applies to, so that you're capturing more of the buildings. And why this is so exciting is because all of that is going to require new materials to become, new materials and building practices to become available and in use in construction. And a lot of that could be regionalized supply chains. So just a couple examples here. Urban Machine is using AI robotics in Oakland to denail salvaged lumber so that it's more quickly and readily and cheaply reusable. And then the Verdant Panel is an example of using agricultural waste from our Central Valley to create structural insulative panels instead of, much higher GWP and synthetic materials. So an example of a local climate action plan is the city of Dublin in our county, who wrote into their plan that they would adopt low carbon concrete code amendment. And they did this year. They're joining others. Marin County was the first one to do it. Palo Alto and Santa Monica have also adopted. And we supported Marin County in developing it. So we have some support resources on our website, stopwaste.org/concrete. And we have supported the development of a calculator, because we know that in the CCAPs and the CPRG, you do need to show an estimation of reduction for each of the measures. So if you wanted to include something on embodied carbon, we're hoping to support with this calculator that we had Arab develop. And I'm just showing a couple of blurry screenshots that aren't going to really help you. But we did do a recording of kind of a walkthrough of this. So I'm hoping that that recording is being put in the chat as well. And I can do a screen share if that makes sense later. So finally, the other kind of durable goods category. This is also universal in that everybody is kind of bringing in durable goods. And the opportunity here varies though, because this is kind of more of a diverse collection of materials. But one I'll highlight is that in Oakland, where they really focused on equity too, they focused on green jobs and green economy. A couple of the things they highlighted or included as measures was to support the reuse, repair, recovery, and refurbishment economy, and to expand community repair resources. So really focusing on keeping the materials in their highest form and value within the community to displace the need to import more goods. So I think a key thing that hopefully Oregon will also highlight is that it's not just about buy local for the food either. I think there was a question earlier about, is it just local food? Most of those emissions, the upstream emissions, are coming from the production, and the shipping is not as much. And I think, the DEQ report gets into more detail on this. But if we wanted to, one strategy is to bring in the manufacturing, but do it cleanly, right? So if you have more control over how efficient and what kind of power is used to do that manufacturing, if it's within your boundaries, than if you're just importing it from who knows where, right? So yeah, in Oakland on the green economy, they did also mention the food and building deconstruction. So there's opportunities across all of these sectors. And this is just a snapshot of how Oakland looked at their life cycle or upstream emissions. And again, these are all available on the EPA's database, so I would definitely check those out. And maybe we'll get into this in the Q&A, but the three that I mentioned, the food, the building materials, and the durable goods, they do also connect with across sectors a bit, right? So food can definitely be in the organics waste side. It's more of an expansion of organics waste management. So it could be in the waste sector of a traditional approach, sector-based approach. The buildings, embodied carbon, could be part of your building strategy. Mostly that's operational carbon, right? It's mostly energy usage. But if you look at that whole life cycle, the embodied carbon, especially if your buildings are efficient and powered by clean energy, it could be up to 20 years worth of your operational carbon budget kind of. So it could just be bundled in with your building sector, and then the manufacturing could be tied to your industrial sector if you're thinking of a strategy of onshoring that manufacturing and doing it clean, maybe with a specific kind of segment of the market in mind. So with that, I believe I'm just turning it right over to Martin. Thank you. Look forward to the discussion.
I'm wondering, do we want to do a quick Q&A on your material, Mia, or?
Yeah, we can. We've got quite a few questions in right now. We can take a pause and address those right now. That's fine. And some of these might actually go further back in the presentation as well. So be prepared for that. The first one is, would local consumption of food help reduce emissions?
Local production of food?
It says local consumption.
Maybe consumption of local food?
Maybe.
We're all consuming food where we are. I think that was the question that I was also trying to address with this, like, it's more the production phase than the transportation phase that makes a difference. So wherever the food can be produced least carbon intensively is where, looking at the whole life cycle. Martin, you went off camera, but you should answer this question too. I think you've looked at this in more depth.
Oh, I'm sorry. I do not have, very, very detailed information about the topic, but David's coming on. Maybe he can talk. In general, transportation impacts are more than people think. Most of the damage to the world is happening in the production phase, and David will have more to say.
We can't hear you, David. David was hard to hear before, so I asked him to see if he could clear up his audio, but now we've lost him completely.
Maybe we can come back to this topic.
Yeah, and I know.
But was it pretty much, what we said? David?
As a general conclusion, for most products where we've looked at this, the perception that transportation of the goods to the marketplace is a big part of the impacts is wrong. Like most of the impact is happening in the production. I think there might be other reasons to prioritize local production, that have to do with economics, equity, et cetera. But from a pure impact point of view, maybe not. I mean, think about raising a banana in a greenhouse, right? That is local, but it's not necessarily efficient.
That example is great, Martin, because it's kind of maybe by localizing, if we pair that with eating seasonally and what makes sense to grow here, in each of our localities, and really localizing our diets more than just localizing the production of whatever it is that we want to eat, then yeah, maybe that is a more holistic low carbon strategy. David?
Okay, can you hear me now?
Yes.
Yeah.
I'm on the phone. This feels like I'm in 1997 or something, but at least the technology is working. Yeah, David Alloway with Oregon DEQ, and I just want to confirm everything that Martin and Mia have said here. It's spot on. For most foods, the greenhouse gas impacts of transportation from the farm or from the factory to the retailer is very small on average. For the U.S. diet, it's 4% of the carbon footprint of food. Actually, the impact of driving your car to the farmer's market to buy a little hallock of strawberries and driving it back to your house is larger than the impact of putting those strawberries, a whole case of strawberries, cases and cases in a single truck and driving it up from California. And there are many case studies in the LCA literature of examples where local food has a higher carbon footprint because of how it was produced or because it was produced and stored out of season. For example, a study from the UK that looked at apples and found that New Zealand apples shipped to the UK in what is New Zealand's fall had a lower carbon footprint than local apples picked 6 months prior and kept in refrigerated cold storage for 6 months because of the energy required to keep the food fresh. So that's just another example. And there are, of course, cases where local food is better from a greenhouse gas perspective. It's just not a very good predictor. And there are other reasons to buy local food, but if we design a greenhouse gas reduction strategy around local food, we're not going to achieve the reductions we need.
Thanks, David. This next question here, I think, Martin, you had expressed interest in responding to. Do consumption-based inventories double count emissions?
Trouble.
There we go.
Sorry, I was having trouble unmuting. The answer is no, but I do think that when we show that Venn diagram, it becomes a little bit confusing. Okay, so the important thing to remember, the difference between territorial emissions and consumption-based emissions is the sort of perspective of who you're looking at. The territorial emissions are very familiar. They are the emissions that happened within a geographic boundary, such as a city or a state. And then sometimes the emissions linked to electricity production, which might be coming from outside, are also added to that. Consumption-based is something totally different. It takes, anybody who's spending money, and so that could be a single person, it could be a household, it could be all the people in a geographic area and all the businesses. And it calculates all the emissions they are responsible for, no matter where those occurred. So if I buy something from Japan, and there were emissions in Japan linked to what I'm buying, they get assigned to me in Oregon. And the reason it gets a little bit confusing and people might think there's double counting is because some of those emissions do overlap. So like when I buy an apple that is from Oregon, there are definitely some impacts, consumption impacts that happened in Oregon. So there's no double counting, but you just got to know what frame of reference you're using.
Hey, Martin, great point. And there could be double counting if, for example, like Oregon makes things that are sold into California and California grows things that are sold into Oregon. If Oregon and California took both of our sector-based inventories and both of our consumption-based emissions inventories and added all 4 of them together, of course there would be double counting. But like, why would you do that in the first place? No one is proposing to do that. The point of the inventories is not to develop and not to generate a bunch of state and local inventories and roll them up into some global total. Nobody is doing that. The point of the inventory is to inform policymakers and the public, how are we contributing to emissions and what can we do about it? And that might be a good segue into your presentation next, Martin.
Perfect. Thank you, David. Yep, we're going to move on to Martin's presentation next. And again, we should have time at the end to revisit questions that are remaining. Thanks.
One more detail about the difference too. One thing that really helped me understand it is that on a global level, consumption-based emissions and the territorial emissions are exactly the same, and the global total is the same. It's just how they're divided up. Okay, so how are we doing on time before I start?
Well, we have another 35 minutes total.
Okay, so I'm thinking this will be 15 to 20 minutes.
Perfect.
So I'm Martin Brown from Oregon DEQ. I work with Jenna from DEQ and David. And today I'm going to try to do something a little bit different and new. I'm going to just talk about how you would calculate emissions reductions for materials management and waste measures. I'm going to give some principles and some examples. And I'm going to try to move the slide. Let's see, does that work? Yes. Okay. So I kind of want to try to bring these calculations down to earth. I'm going to list some actual examples of materials management measures for which Oregon DEQ has calculated emissions reductions. Some of these examples have appeared in our reports or our CPRG grant application. Some of them were just things I did around the office. I'm going to try to include waste-based examples and consumption-based examples. Although we're super excited about consumption-based accounting, I know that it's easier and more conventional to work with waste statistics. And I'm also going to name the models we use and some alternatives that you might use. But before I get into that, I have a whole bunch of disclaimers. And the most important disclaimer is that I am not EPA. I am not responsible in any way for evaluating CCAPs. I'm not an authority. I'm just a guy who has done this sort of thing and thought about it. So if you need any guidance, talk to the actual EPA. Fine details are going to be omitted to save time. I'm not sure what your technical level is. So for some of you, this is going to be way too simple. And for others, it might be complex. If you really want technical details, a lot of stuff is fleshed out in a couple of different public documents. First, those reports about consumption-based emissions that we just mentioned. And also in our CPRG competitive grant application, there's a big technical appendix, which really digs into it. And I think that's a public document. Also, you'll see I've written a lot on the slides that are going to be coming up. You don't need to read all that text. I intentionally wrote out details on these slides, which is not my usual way of doing things, just so it would be in a record that you could look at later, like there are links on the slides. And let's see, last disclaimer, we might want to start with a little pep talk. So if you get nothing else from this, I would say when you're approaching this subject, do not get perfection paralysis. Do not start worrying that because you can't figure out an exact answer for some factor, you can't know something for sure, that, don't get so concerned with that stuff that it stops you. And I think you should take some inspiration from the history of science. I mean, everything in science starts out with a crude observation, a rough estimate. In the study of gravity, there is a legend that Galileo went up to the top of the Tower of Pisa and dropped things off to evaluate, the relationships, to evaluate gravity. The guy is a genius, and that's how he started, right? Once you've got the rough estimate, you can start refining things, making it better. And by now, we know so much about gravitation that we can use microscopic changes in gravitational pull detected by a space probe to make a map of the planet Venus, which is what the Magellan probe did. So, the pep talk is just get started, then make it better. It doesn't need to be perfect to start. So in general, when you're trying to figure out the emissions reduction associated with anything, there's going to be, there's going to be some common ingredients, no matter what the measure is. So first of all, and I'll describe all of these in more detail, but just as a general outline, you're going to have one or more greenhouse gas inventories and also probably some helpful supplementary data. Then you're going to make projections of emissions in two scenarios. One scenario is business as usual, or the reference case, which is kind of the standard thing you expect to happen. And then there's also a scenario where you do your measure and it works. So that would be called the measure scenario or the treatment scenario. And really what you're going to try to find out is the difference between those two. Along the way, you're going to be explicitly noting, contributing factors. The contributing factors are the things that affect your two different projections. And, sometimes you're not going to know for sure all of those things. Sometimes you're going to have to estimate them. And as long as you're just aware of when you're estimating and when you are assuming, that's enough for you to make some progress. Finally, it's also good. It's probably, and I believe it's part of the CCAP requirements to have cost estimates, because you're going to want to actually do your measure in the real world, so you're going to have to pay for it. I am not going to talk, except for right now, about cost, but there have been a couple of instances this year where I have been really, really positively surprised by cost estimates that I've worked with or read. Not shown in the slide, but in our PCAP and in our competitive CPRG grant application, we calculated the per ton abated cost of a number of materials management measures. And some of them were surprisingly low and competitive, or even superior to sort of traditional, like energy-based methods of trying to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. So I'd say don't be afraid. You might discover something good. On a more complex basis, our recent work with the Stockholm Environmental Institute yielded this marginal abatement cost curve, where the consultant looked at a bunch of consumption-based actions that could result in emissions reductions, and found that in their frame of reference, there were actually some negative costs. We were saving emissions while lowering costs. You're going to have to look at the report for all the details of what how those costs were calculated. All right. So once again, you do not need to read this entire slide. So you're going to start with an inventory. And to me, I'm sure the EPA has some formal requirement, but to me, an inventory is sort of a broad total of emissions or whatever you're looking at, broken down into some useful categories. So, you know, our state produces two different greenhouse gas inventories. There's the territorial one and the consumption-based one. But and your state may have things like that, you know, but there are also other sources for inventories, either territorial or consumption-based, and they're listed down at the bottom of the slide. But important point, I have found that working on this topic, it is usually not enough to just have the information in the inventory. Usually you're going to need some supplemental data that tells you more about whatever you're working on. So for example, if you're working on a solid waste related project, you're going to probably want to know more about solid waste than appears in the inventory. So I think that's sort of a missing link that's not talked about a lot. The inventory is not enough to get started. It's essential for your perspective, but it's not enough to do one of these calculations. All right, now I saw that, apologies, this looks a little crazy, but I drew this by hand just to show that the basic idea is simple. You're going to be projecting emissions into the future. Under one scenario, business as usual. Under the other scenario, whatever you're doing, and the difference between them is the emissions reduction. So, you know, conceptually, that's all it is. Now, I know practically getting to both of these lines, you know, does involve complications. For example, population will be changing. But there's some things to sort of either look out for or to look forward to. One thing that I've found helpful is that usually when you're working on a measure, and we'll talk about some in a minute, it's really only about one very small part of the inventory. So you're really only trying to make a projection for that part of the inventory, you know, under your two scenarios. You don't need to worry about all the categories like, I don't know, agriculture or whatever that you're not involved in. So that makes it a little bit more approachable to me. Also, you're going to want to watch out for complications that could reduce your reductions. For example, if you're doing a program where you divert food waste from a landfill to composting, one complication might be transportation impacts would change. But on the other hand, you're also going to watch out for synergies or side effects that could increase the reductions. And there's some examples of that when I get to smart growth. All right, now I'm just going to go into 4 examples. And hopefully this is not too much to talk about. I'll spend more time here on this first one. So the first one I have here is food waste diversion to composting. And I included this one because I think it's the most common idea I've been asked about in my time at DEQ. So the basic idea is that, you know, there is food waste that is currently going to landfill, but it could go to composting or anaerobic digestion. So to work on this idea, if I was working on it, I'd probably start with our state territorial inventory, because I know that has some totals for landfill emissions. However, at least our particular territorial inventory doesn't say anything about what the materials in the landfill are, right? So I also got some perspective. I used supplementary data in the form of our life cycle impact model of the solid waste stream, which does break down end-of-life emissions in useful categories, and one of them is food. So that is the kind of situation, that's the kind of role for the supplemental data. It gives you the detailed information that helps you work with that total from the inventory. So now I need a tool to project, to estimate emissions. And I used our model for Oregon, which is called the Waste Impact Calculator. It's a life cycle model, a life cycle impact model about solid waste, and it includes food and other materials. But I'll also note that you could use WARM in a similar way. WARM is also a life cycle impact model for solid waste. So notable factors that might help, define scenarios. Our population growth, they'd probably be the same for both scenarios. Transportation distances, that would be probably different for the scenarios. And capacity limits is one thing we've worked with. Maybe, under our measure, maybe there's a maximum capacity for composting. Maybe we're not going to be able to take all of the food waste, even if we can collect it and compost it. So just one comment about this approach, which I've used a number of times because I've been asked this question a lot, is that you do need to remember in this circumstance that both Waste Impact Calculator and WARM are life cycle models, and usually in these circumstances, you're being asked for yearly impacts or impacts over a span of years. So you're going to need to make a conversion there, but the conversion is usually much simpler than it sounds. And talk to me later about that, because I don't want to get into the details and bog down everything. So next is moving upstream, like Mia was talking about. Could do a measure that's about food waste prevention. So instead of dealing with food waste at the end of life, the concept is you could prevent food waste from being generated in the first place. And I think the really fascinating thing about this one is actually I came up with 2 or 3 different ways to do this. One of them is waste-based. One of them is, one of them is consumption-based. So to me, I think the relevant inventory here to start with would be a consumption-based inventory if you have one, because as Mia was saying before, most of the impacts from food are in production, and that could happen in all sorts of places. So that's where I would get the perspective for the total impact sort of in the category that we're dealing with. But then I would probably look at that life cycle impact model for solid waste to get perspective of what might be changed about food. That's so similar to before. I could use a life cycle impact model of solid waste, and Waste Impact Calculator is one, WARM is another one. But in this case, the sort of scenario that you're working with isn't that we're changing what happens at the end of life, is that there's less of that food waste being generated. So there's notable factors in defining the scenarios would be first, population growth. That's probably common to all the scenarios, but also realistic expectations for how much food waste could be prevented. I know when I've tried it in my own home, it's pretty difficult to make a large reduction in food waste. So there is some research about what size of changes might be plausible. Once again, same sort of caveat. If you use a life cycle model, you might need to convert it to yearly impacts. But I want to emphasize here, this was a circumstance where I thought of kind of a simpler way to do it that relied on a pretty easy to utilize consumption-based resource. If less food waste is being generated, then that means people are spending less on food in some way. If there's a reduction in expenses on food, then there will be a reduction in supply chain impacts. And you could actually estimate that change using a product from the US EPA, which are the supply chain greenhouse gas factors based on the US EEIO consumption-based modeling system. And that's a pretty complex system to work with for most people, but these supply chain factors have been made available in Excel. And so this is a way to sort of get started with supply chain or consumption-based modeling that doesn't require you to be a programmer or an expert in economics. All right. In terms of the built environment, one of the things we've looked at DEQ is encouraging smaller housing and also what might be called retrofit housing, things like commercial to residential conversions. And there's a couple ways that those might reduce greenhouse gas emissions, but in this measure, I'm just going to think about the embodied carbon in them. So the idea is that the action the government would take would be to subsidize or encourage the creation of more materially efficient housing. And we're going to replace conventional suburban single-family residential development. So that's the sort of difference between the two scenarios. Starting point for what the total impacts in our whole state or region would be consumption-based inventory. But then the tool for defining the sort of differences in emissions between the scenarios. For this example, I chose the AirUp embodied carbon tool that's available from StopWaste. That's what Mia was talking about earlier. I think this calculator is pretty useful because within the field of architecture and buildings, there are a lot of calculators for individual buildings. But this AirUp tool is one that lets you work with whole development patterns, like 10-story apartment buildings, or 100 single-family houses, or something like that. So it's a little bit broader than those individual building models. And you'd be inputting for different scenarios, things like square footage, housing forms, anticipated material efficiencies, and so on. And you'd get a result from it. I believe this is one of the models that sort of presents you with the difference as the result. And that's always something to look out for. Some models are set up so that they show you as the result the difference between two scenarios. And that could be useful because that's where you're ultimately trying to calculate. But you just want to be aware of that, because sometimes you actually do want to know the two numbers that you're subtracting. Sometimes you do want to know the total emissions for the business as usual and the total emissions for the alternative scenarios. So again, that's a sort of consumption-based tool that doesn't require you to get into full-out modeling exercise. However, if you are willing to get into the full complexity of economy-wide consumption-based modeling, you can do more complex measures. And so the last one I'm going to talk about is smart growth. So this example appears in two different forms in DEQ's recent report about consumption-based emissions. But the basic idea in the two different examples is that we're going to provide new housing and related sort of services in more compact and walkable communities. So this is a pretty broad type of action. And so there's a lot of data that's going to be fed into it. First of all, we have the state consumption-based inventory as the starting point. But then we also need to extract from that, in order to do some of this modeling, the emissions intensities, that's the emissions per dollar, in a bunch of different economic categories. And we also need to know a whole bunch of different background information to help us understand how the different scenarios, how the scenarios differ, business as usual versus the treatment. So there's too many of those to name, but just to give you a few, we use statistical studies of consumption-based emissions in other communities. We had transport modeling from the Oregon Department of Transportation and a bunch of other information. Using all that, the consultant, Stockholm Environmental Institute, made a projection of overall statewide consumption-based emissions under the reference and treatment scenarios. And the cool thing is that doing it with this sort of ambitious model allows you to recognize the sort of multi-pronged effect of smart growth. This measure can create sizable emissions reductions because it's influencing many sources of emissions: transportation, housing, infrastructure, and even a little bit domestic purchases. So we don't expect that everybody's going to get to this level of modeling right away, but it does show that once you get to that high level of sophistication, you can produce some pretty impressive results. And once again, a lot of the examples I just talked about are in the consumption-based report that we just published. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Martin. Appreciate that. And there's his contact information. So yeah, if everyone can come on camera, we'll get to a few more questions that we have in our remaining time. So one question is, and I believe David is queued up to answer this one: do policies based on consumption-based accounting run into problems with legal authority to regulate out-of-state activities and entities?
Thank you. Joy, can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, wonderful. Okay, so full disclosure, I'm not an attorney and I'm not providing legal counsel here. I think the answer depends on what the policy is. So if you think about the example Martin shared around zoning changes that might cause more missing middle, more duplex and space-efficient housing to be built, or smart growth. Those are consumption-based policies that will reduce the quantity of materials used and are not regulating producers. And certainly they're within the bailiwick. I mean, local governments have authority to develop their own zoning. So that's not, there's no like legal problems there. Where there are potential legal problems is if a state or local government adopts a policy that is discriminatory towards a class of businesses. And here I'm talking specifically about the Dormant Commerce Clause, which is this sort of court-created piece of constitutional law. It's not actually in the Constitution, but it was established by court decisions that the states cannot regulate by the Constitution, states cannot regulate interstate commerce, but states can impose requirements on materials sold into their states if those policies do not discriminate in a way that appears to regulate out-of-state commerce. So, for example, if a state said, out-of-state producers have to sell us low-carbon stuff, but in-state producers don't have to, that would clearly be a violation of the Dormant Commerce Clause. But if a state just says, anything sold into our state, wherever it's come from, has to have a carbon footprint lower than X, that's not discriminatory. Now, whether or not the courts would allow it actually depends on the court. There have been cases like this that have gone to the Fifth Circuit where the court has rejected it. There have been cases that have gone to the Ninth Circuit where the courts have approved it. And tellingly, there was a major case that went to the U.S. Supreme Court that was decided just last year. It was California Proposition 12, which was a ballot measure in California adopted by the voters that would require pork producers producing pork that ends up only in bacon or pork chops to provide gestational sows with a minimum amount of square footage so that they're not like locked in these cages so they can't move. And the Pork Producers Association took the case all the way up to the Supreme Court, and the U.S. Supreme Court, in its current composition, I must add here, ruled 5-4 to uphold the California ballot measure. And they said specifically, this is not a violation of the Dormant Commerce Clause because it is treating all pork producers the same. It's not discriminating against out-of-state producers. And Neil Gorsuch, writing for the majority, said, quote, "While the Constitution addresses many weighty issues, the type of pork chops California merchants may sell is not on the list," unquote. So this decision and the precedent gives me some hope, along with many other laws. I mean, like the state of Washington has a law that limits the amount of mercury that can be in fluorescent light tubes. No fluorescent light tubes manufactured in Washington state, but that law has not been challenged for its constitutionality. So sorry, kind of a long-winded answer here, but I think a well-designed policy that's carefully designed with a consultation with attorneys can be legal and can be used to influence out-of-state production. Thanks.
Thank you, David. I think we have time for one more here, and Mia's indicated she'd like to address this comment that we have. The comment is that historically, low-embodied carbon materials are more expensive. It's great to replace conventional development, but we still have an overwhelming low number of affordable housing. Mia?
Yeah, thank you. Just on materiality, we did look when we were developing the Marin concrete code at concrete specifically, and we had a couple of affordable housing projects that were able to do it, cost neutrally to reduce the embodied carbon. But I think your question is prompting a bigger conversation, right? It's like, how can we supply the needed housing and housing security for everybody in the most material efficient way possible, kind of. And as I think Jenna maybe pointed out, maybe it was you, Martin, there is underutilized building stock, right? So how can we convert some of that already existing, which is like the lowest carbon, it's already existing. It's not going to require as many materials to begin with, into housing units that people can live in. There's also kind of a missing middle housing area where it's not the high rises that are going to be concrete and steel. We can make them with lower carbon materials if we're building on like a smaller scale and doing more infill type of building and smaller buildings that Martin also highlighted. And David, what do you want to add?
Yeah, thank you, Mia. Oregon was fortunate to receive a CPRG grant, an implementation grant from EPA that includes a little over $25 million to provide financial incentives for both of those types of projects you just mentioned, Mia. It's about providing affordable and worker affordable housing by converting existing commercial buildings into residential and doing more of the sort of missing middle duplexes, et cetera. And back to the choice of materials, in our report, we have a citation to a 2021 study from the Rocky Mountain Institute, which ran case studies of several projects in the Pacific Northwest that found projects were able to reduce embodied carbon by, I'm looking for the number here, up to 46% with a cost premium of less than 1%. Associated with alternative materials. So yeah, sometimes the alternative low carbon materials don't cost any more at all, and sometimes they do cost more, but if you do it right, you can get really steep reductions in embodied carbon with a very, very modest cost premium.
Thank you, David. With that, we're running out of time. I'm just going to wrap things off administratively and just let you all know that the slides and the recording will be posted on the forum website, and I'll send out an email to everyone who registered for the webinar, so you make sure you have access to that when it's available. But I'll turn it over to Jenny for some closing remarks.
Yeah, well, the last question really segues nicely into the forum's next webinar, because one of the core aspects of what we'll be talking about next webinar is incorporating diversity, equity, and inclusion in materials management. And one of the case studies featured will be the city of Oakland, and having low-income housing or housing for everyone was kind of one of the core aspects of their equitable climate action plan, and they put equitable right in there. And so we'll have a speaker talking about, they conducted a racial equity impact assessment and implementation guide. And we're also going to be featuring a case study, again from Oregon, but a different part of their awesome work, on how they incorporated and advanced equity principles across major elements of a piece of significant legislation. So we hope you will register at that link right there, and join us November 19th for that conversation and those presentations. And as we reference more links, we will also be sending out a document that included all the links and texts of the valuable resources shared today. And just want to thank you for joining us, and a huge shout out and thanks to our presenters, Martin, Jenna, David, Mia. Thank you for sharing your insights and examples as we work to advance this work on addressing the climate materials connection. So thank you all, and go to the forum and register for the next webinar too, and hope to see you there.